2 development cycles. That's a number that only a few games hold, and Pokemon Gold and Silver is one of them. Prior to 1998, the development of Pokemon Gold and Silver involved making a very different game that took place in a map that featured the whole of Japan, with Kanto being compressed to just 1 city and Johto covering only 3 cities. While still a very thought out and varied map, it was still overall smaller than the final game's map, and it was clear that Game Freak still wished to incorporate Kanto in some ways. There just wasn't enough space on the Game Boy cart to fully realize their dream. And so enter President of HAL Laboratory, Satoru Iwata. While President, he still was a programming genius and had assisted Game Freak prior by porting the battle system of Pokemon Red and Green to Pokemon Stadium in just 1 week. This time he made Game Freak a compression tool in order to size down the programming code, and it worked incredibly well to not just have a map that was the size of the original world map, but also enough to fit a second one. And so in 1998, Game Freak decided to follow through on their ambitions to not only bring back the full map of Kanto from Generation 1, but also to develop a whole new map based on the Kansai region of Japan to serve as the second world map, dubbed as Johto. And while this new map of Johto had many definitive ideas in its dual map setup, it was still very different from the final game's map and went through several revisions. Everything from cut gym leaders, merged areas, and even an entire cut city. And so today on Cut Content, we'll be exploring the beta maps of Johto from Pokemon Gold and Silver. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell too to further support us and keep creating new videos. While the first game does contain a few of those beta maps within its data, the grand bulk comes from both a 1999 Space World ROM of the game and, biggest of all, a massive leak of the source code of Pokemon Gold and Silver from April 2020. It contains not just the earliest versions of the new maps of Kanto and Johto, but also a small update to the 1997 map that we covered in our last video, before it was abandoned. This newer version was not too different, with overall just a bit more detail, such as the inclusion of signposts here and there. But there were still some major changes, which we'll go over quickly. The biggest being West City, New Type, and Kanto, all having rails for the magnet train, available right there through the city, and as well a respective station for said rails. While the final game had them in Goldenrod City and Saffron City, a third city having them does add a further sense of connectivity. This was followed by a few geographical changes too, such as high-tech exit bridges that would normally lead to West City and Burdon, now have these small islands attached to the ends of them, possibly having a ferry that would take you to these cities now. As well, the gym and the Pokemon centers in Burdon were swapped, and as well there was a smaller mountain between Silent Hill and Prince. And with that concludes what may be the final versions of the 1997 maps, and the beginning of the earliest versions of the Kanto and Johto dual map. We'll be comparing the many revisions of these maps, town by town. Starting off with none other than New Bark Town. The earliest map is this one here, with only 3 houses. Clearly unfinished, considering its predecessor Silent Hill even had 4 homes, but the influence is still there, with the water, fence, and lab at the bottom. This is followed by the next 2 maps, which have a similar layout, with the 4th house added now. The third map is interesting, as it has a Pokemon Center, something that may have been influenced from the original starting town of Silent Hill. But it seems the waterway to the right was finally being added at this point. But eventually, the Pokemon Center was removed and all the houses moved around in a more unique fashion for the final game's design. Going left, we entered the traditional Route 29. The earliest map is very linear and straightforward at that, with a giant body of water that looks seemingly useless. But the next 2 maps are where they go from 0 to 70 real fast in complexity. This looks a lot like the map from the first route for the 1997 build actually, that featured a hill-like cave in order to get through the route. This time, there were actual caves from the get-go. It's quite possible that they decided to change it, as it might have turned off new players because of its complexity. Now on to Cherry Grove City. That actually looks like a city here. I mean, this is a completely different place. The first one here is full of Japanese architecture, including a number of homes on the left and this big Japanese castle. But this actually does make a lot of sense actually. Cherry Grove City is based off of Nagoya City, which is the 4th largest city in Japan, and also has a lot of Japanese architecture too, including the famous Nagoya Castle, which this is based on. But as well, it has a gym here at this stage. Either this would have been the first gym really early on, or this could have been another Gen 1 situation where this would have been last, much as how the Viridian City gym was last despite being the first place you visit. The second map, however, while large, definitely did tone it down. No Japanese architecture, or gym for that matter, before being further relegated to this port stop city in the final game. A real shame as the first map just looks so amazing. Now going up, Route 30 is a lot shorter, featuring no houses, including Mr. Pokemon's house. A weird trend between the first two routes of early Johto seems to be that there are no grass patches you are forced to cross. One that might actually continue for a while it seems. But this is followed by Route 31. Again very simple, but this house is possibly the Mr. Pokemon house that was missing from Route 30. As well, there was no cave here back then. Now Violet City looks to have a lot more going for it. While it's not any bigger, the two early versions not only featured the Sprout Tower, with its first version being extra tall at that, but also had a lot of Japanese looking houses too, all stripped down to basically just a tower in the final game. An interesting trend here with the de-Japanification of these maps it seems. Might have been because they want to appeal to the worldwide audience, maybe? As well, the cave leading to the ruins of Alph wasn't here yet in this first map, with the Sprout Tower being in the place of it. Now speaking of the Sprout Tower, 8 was very massive back then, ticking at 9 floors tall, actually resembling the amount of floors even seen outside. All 9 maps exist too in all their complexity. Considering this was an early town, this might be why they nerfed Sprout Tower down in the final game. But overall, the city map was reshaped into a more asymmetrical design as time went. Now welcome to Hoenn. Just kidding, it's just Route 32 below Violet City. A very awkward early map at that, it seems. It is full of water and has this super tiny linear path on the left to walk through to the very end of the map. I'm guessing that this was very unfinished here considering how the final map is completely different with its geometry. Also, once again, no ruins of Alph, but also no Union Cave either. So normally, Route 32 would lead you to a cave that would lead you to Azalea Town. However, in the early map of Johto, you instead hit a cut town. This cut town is labeled as Singu, which likely refers to the port city of Shingu, Japan. This replicates a port location well too at that. It is extremely small, the smallest town of the game if it stayed in outside of the destroyed Cinnabar Island. But surprisingly, it featured a gym here too. A second small map of this exists too that was actually found in the data of the final game, featuring a remix of this map, but overall pretty similar. Now considering Shingu existed in place of the final game's cave, the original Route 33 was actually quite simple like the other early routes. However, the next version of the map was revised into this complex monstrosity between Shingu and Azalea Town, featuring what might have been an early version of the final game's cave. At the same time, it looks a lot like the second and third revisions of Route 29 that had these complex hill caves too. A clear trend before they simplified these routes after complexifying them in the first place. Now finally to Azalea Town. Truly feels like those 20 episodes Ash took to get here now, doesn't it? But it is a lot smaller compared to the final games. I mean, the final game's Azalea Town was small, but this is ridiculous! I mean, Shingu effectively pushed the route further west. As such, it left little room for Azalea Town here. In fact, that might be the very reason why Shingu was axed, so we could get a bigger town here. I mean, it's literally two small towns with gyms parted by either a very simple route or an overly complex one. Though the second map of Azalea Town did get rid of the gym. Guess in that case there at least is only one gym between them, which theoretically would have been held by Bugsy here too. I guess getting rid of Shingu made Bugsy move back here then. But aside from the size, the biggest missing piece is the Slowpoke well, which might mean that the whole Slowpoke Tail quest might have not been here. Strange considering the well even existed in the 97 build. As well, I wager that this house in these two maps is where Kurt lives, in order to make you Pokeballs. Now the Elex Forest was entirely absent from the earliest map, and you just go into the straight route to Goldenrod City. But the 1999 demo did provide us with an early Ilex forest. Now the basic shape is similar with the final games, but the trees are completely different, having more of a pine shape instead. Biggest of all, however, is that the shrine that is used to summon Celebi was not implemented yet at this stage. Now on to Route 34. It's a much simpler design that had a rather long stretch of grass that you were actually required to cross. I guess that made up for all the early routes to let you avoid grass entirely. The biggest change, of course, is that there was no daycare yet. It's possible that the breeding mechanics weren't finalized yet. But going up brings us to Goldenrod City. Like with the final 97 build, the rails for the magnet train are here from the get-go. As well, in both these maps, the radio tower is here. Though the first one is a very straight tower, unlike the second and final map that have more of a building structure to them. The general layout of both of these maps are very different from the final games, with surprisingly no big buildings in sight, not even the department store. Yes, Celadon City was set to serve as the game's sole department store back then. Otherwise, a good revamp later rearranged everything into a more asymmetrical fashion to fit the big city look as intended. Seems symmetrical designs overall were common in these early stages, but the oddity here is that there is a gate to the left, which to contrast, there was nothing like that in the final game. What that leads to is this large waterway that one can take to Olivine City. A really neat interconnected design in my opinion, but for now we'll instead head the natural way by going to Route 35. Route 35, while different, had the essential basics of the final game, down to the grass on the right and even the water on the left. Now in the final game, when you go north, you normally get to the national park. However, back then, you went straight into an old version of Route 36. But upon closer inspection of the original Route 36, it actually has traits of the national park too, before it even existed. Specifically, the lakes are of the same shape as the one from the final game's national park. Basically, they split up the route into two maps for the final game. Otherwise, the final game's versions basically redid the whole map of Route 36 and added a choke point with pseudo-wudo blocking it, and not letting you get into Ecruteak City right away. Also an interesting thing is that while it looks like you could exit here to what is the Ruins of Alph in the final game, the Ruins of Alph weren't implemented here yet, and so this is an empty entrance for the moment. But now the short Route 37 up north isn't too different actually. In fact, it might be one of the most similar to the final games, with most pieces in place. Biggest difference being the lack of grass up top. And now we are finally at Ecruteak City. The original Ecruteak City definitely looked odd, with everything kinda to the sides and one Pokemart dead center. As well, the gym was all the way to the top corner behind a ton of trees. I mean, I guess having a ghost gym be in the spooky woods would be fitting. Now, much like the previous early maps like Cherry Grove and Violet City, this one also had more Japanese architecture too compared to the final games. Now, the two biggest things to discuss here are the towers. The Tin Tower is basically in the right place, but you can actually see the top of it back then, which kinda kills the mystery around its top as Ho does live there. Now, the Bird Tower isn't so burnt here actually, but just a smaller tower. Considering this was supposed to be Lugia's tower, it's kinda unfair as to why Lugia gets the smaller one. Granted, this also might have been an era where Lugia wasn't even conceived yet, and Ho was the sole box legendary still. Otherwise, by the final game, the town was definitely cleaned up to look more varied and together. Now moving left to Route 38, the map was quite simple compared to the final games. Technically 3 paths here exist, but one could just avoid the tall grass and zip right through, unlike the hoops one has to take in the final game. Which brings us to Route 39, where we visit this little farm that's not so little originally. While the enterable buildings were the same, the extra buildings definitely made for a bigger farm. However, the fenced area is missing, which might mean the tall grass was meant as a farm ground back then? Maybe this pond was also considered part of it? Maybe it even wasn't a farm? Hard to say. But here we are in Olivine City. The general landmarks are all here, including the gym and the lighthouse, but the city is quite a bit bigger with a lot more houses all over the place. Though most are pretty useless since they lack an entry, might be why they did downscale it in the end. The lighthouse looked quite jarring though without windows here. Makes you wonder where it would then be shining a light from if those top windows aren't even there. But as per usual, if you go south, you can swim on Route 40. Granted, this beta version is just all water, while the final one had some of the Olivine shoreline here. Now normally, this would take us to the Whirl Islands on Route 41 that would then lead to Cianwood City. But instead, the original leads to this left gate of Goldenrod City. Yes, Cianwood City simply didn't exist back then. And if my theory about Lugia possibly not being implemented yet was true too, then there was no reason for the Whirl Islands to exist either. I mean, this does simplify the route, but it's a pretty pointless set of routes considering you are going back to a city you already once went to. The only reason I think they'd have it mapped back to Goldenrod City would be either for clever design or maybe the Team Rocket takeover of Goldenrod City happened earlier and this was just a direct way to get there. But I guess Cianwood City might have been added later once they did decide to scrap the town of Xingu. A much better idea considering Cianwood was a much better coastal town. Now circling back to Ecruteak City, we head right to Route 42. Basically a completely different map. With how simple and straight this was, I almost feel these routes sometimes were more basic placeholders. No Mount Mortar, no water. Heck, without Pseudo Voodoo's choke point on Route 36 and the lack of water here, one could technically zip all the way past here without attaining a single badge. But regardless, here we are in Mahogany Town. This one has two beta maps, the earliest one's most distinct feature being a lack of a gym and instead having a tower. While it is entirely possible this was a gym, this build already had 8 gyms, so this tower might have had a different purpose. Possibly the original Team Rocket HQ? The next map, however, is very similar to the final games, but with the gym and the Pokemon Center in opposite places, and as well one Japanese looking house still around that was quickly westernized for the final game. Now going up to Route 43, the map is another one of those few that isn't too different from the final games with real thought put into it. The long vertical stretches of grass, it just had less water really. But here we are, the map that originally made me interested in making this video, the Lake of Rage. Now why did this map interest me so much? It's cause it had a whole gym and town at one point. Now this one has 2 older maps to it. While the shape of the lake hardly changed between them, it's everything in the top left that wildly changed map to map. Originally there was a very large tower here. Considering how deep in the forest it was, it is possible that Team Rocket's plot was in effect here instead. Maybe it contained the legendary Pokemon? Of course, the fishing guru's house is missing here at the bottom right too. Now the next map replaced that tower with an entire town actually. The Pokemon Center here does explain why this was the literal only location which you could fly to without there being a Pokemon Center in the final game. Likely a leftover of the second build. However, the gym is of course the big prize here. But alas, by the final game, they somewhat went back to its initial design on the top left, with the tower now being replaced by a house and a massive maze. Now going right of Mahogany Town is Route 44. The layout isn't too different actually, with the 2 middle water paths still there including the grass. But no ice cavern back then, and thus instead you go straight to Blackthorn City. Now on first sight, my initial reaction is, why is this city so green? I mean, the mountains are all here, but are all green. Guess they were just regular hills back then? But as for the city itself, its layout was basically completely different. The gym being on the bottom right with no lakes or caves. Instead we have this big hill and tree maze up top that leads to this tower here. I guess Claire's challenge to enter the Dragon's Den back then was maybe instead to enter this Dragon Tower maybe? Yeah, they were really overdoing it with these towers back then. A smart change, I say. In fact, the whole redesign looks so much better. Now with all 8 badges attained, it is time to venture back in order to hit the Pokemon League. Thus taking us into Route 45, which is literally the same as the final games outside of the lack of tall grass here. Also, it is missing the Dark Cave. We sure are missing a lot of caves back then. makes me theorize that maybe all those towers might have become caves later on. Route 36 that just follows it is a little different, but generally similar to the final game's build still, but also slightly simpler with easy descending hills. Also, it lacked the entrance to the Dark Cave here too. And once you get back to New Barktown, you get to Route 27 on your way back to the League. This being again one of those infamous straight routes again. Like this one is super bare. The house is surprisingly still here, but Tojo Falls is not here. Literally no water anywhere to act as a barrier and letting you head this direction at the start of the game too. But surprisingly, Route 26 was quite deeply designed in contrast. The general design being the same, with the house on the left still being here, the water to the right, and the house at the end that will lead you to Victory Road. In the data of the final game exists a map called the Haunted House. This map was to exist on Route 26. It is a 4-floor location, rather bare and kinda resembling the Pokemon Mansion from Cinnabar Island, with its desks and computers. Despite being called a haunted house, it sure was more of a laboratory or office that might have had a tragedy that led to it being haunted. Of course, the next time we get a haunted house wasn't until Generation 4. Like a lot of Generation 2's cut content. And lastly is Route 23, the Pokemon League, featuring a longer walk to the building, but with a building that has a rather odd shape to it in contrast to the final games. And these were the earliest iterations of the Maps of Johto, featuring both familiar and unfamiliar ideas were reworked into what we know as the beloved and sensible map of Johto in the final game. But of course, that is only half the adventure, as there is still the other half of the game's beta maps to explore. So next time, we shall conclude the last of the Generation 2 map series with the Beta Maps of Kanto, from a cut safari zone to a lively Cinnabar Island. So hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back with more Pokemon and other games cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on if you would have preferred any of the older versions of the final game's maps. So everyone, thank you for watching.